On a Prayer, Faith is Awaken by Elton. Episode 30, The Power of Selfless Prayer. The quiet stillness of the early morning filled the sanctuary of First Believers Church, broken only by the soft rustle of the breeze slipping through the cracked stained glass windows. Dusty Rhymes sat alone in one of the front pews, the cool wood pressing against his back as he gazed up at the cross that hung above the altar. The church was empty, save for the flicker of candles that cast a soft golden glow over the stone walls. Outside, the world was beginning to stir, but here, in the quiet of the church, Dusty felt a peace he hadn't known before. He had been coming here more frequently since Jackson had been imprisoned, seeking out the quiet moments of reflection that had become part of his routine. Each visit brought him closer to a truth he was still trying to understand, a truth about faith, prayer, and the power that had moved through him in ways he couldn't explain. For weeks, Dusty had wrestled with the mechanics of his powers, trying to make sense of the impossible things that had happened, the bullets that had stopped in midair, the strength that had surged through him when he needed it most, the way Jackson had vanished only to reappear in a jail cell. Logic told him there had to be an explanation, but faith whispered that some things were beyond understanding. Dusty sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped in front of him. He had never been one to pray, not really. At least, not in the traditional sense. But now, sitting in the quiet of the sanctuary, he felt the urge to speak, to reach out into the silence and offer something, though he wasn't sure what. His thoughts drifted back to the past few months, to everything that had led him here. He had seen miracles, yes, but more than that, he had seen the power of prayer, not just his own, but the prayers of others, the prayers of Pastor Ethan, Megan, Roxy, and even Mila. Each one of them had prayed for someone else, had offered up their hopes, their fears, their faith, not for themselves, but for others. And that's when it hit him. Prayer wasn't about asking for something. It wasn't about demanding answers or miracles. It wasn't even about understanding. It was about selflessness. It was about giving, about offering up your heart, your hope, your love, for someone else. Dusty closed his eyes, his mind swirling with the realization. All this time, he had been trying to figure out how his powers worked, trying to understand the mechanics behind them. But now, in the quiet of the church, he understood that it wasn't about the how. It was about the why. Every time he had prayed, whether he realized it or not, it had been for someone else. Every time he had wished for a good outcome, for safety, for protection, it had been for someone else. He had never prayed for himself, and that was the key. That was why the powers had come to him. That was why they had manifested when they did. Selflessness. The realization settled over him like a warm blanket, the tension in his chest easing as he let out a long breath. Dusty had always been a man of action, a man who fought for what was right, who put others before himself. But he had never understood that his greatest strength didn't come from his fists, or even from his powers. It came from his heart, from his willingness to fight for others, to pray for others, even when he didn't realize he was doing it. A soft creak echoed through the sanctuary, and Dusty opened his eyes to see Pastor Ethan standing in the doorway, his hands folded in front of him, a gentle smile on his face. Ethan had a way of appearing at just the right moment, as if he knew when Dusty needed him most. "You've been here a lot lately," Ethan said, his voice quiet but warm. "I take it something's been on your mind?" Dusty smiled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "Yeah," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I've been trying to figure out, well, everything, I guess." Ethan stepped closer, taking a seat beside Dusty in the pew. "That's a tall order," he said with a chuckle. "But I'm listening." Dusty leaned back, his gaze drifting up to the cross once more. "I've been thinking a lot about prayer, about how it works, about why things happened the way they did, and I think I'm starting to understand." Ethan tilted his head, his eyes curious. "Go on." Dusty swallowed, his hands tightening slightly in his lap. "It's not about asking for things. It's not even about miracles. It's about selflessness. Every time I've prayed, Whether I knew it or not, it was for someone else. For Mila, for Roxy, for all the people I've tried to save. And I think that's where the power comes from. Not from me, but from the intent behind the prayer. Ethan smiled softly, his eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. You're right, Dusty. Prayer isn't about what we can get from it. It's about what we give. When we pray for someone else, we're offering up our love, our hope, our faith for their well-being. And that's where the true power of prayer lies, in its selflessness. Dusty nodded, his heart swelling with the truth of Ethan's words. I've spent so long trying to figure out how my powers work, but now I think, maybe I don't need to understand the mechanics. Maybe it's enough to know that when I pray for someone else, when I put their needs before mine, that's when the strength comes. Ethan placed a hand on Dusty's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. Faith isn't about understanding everything, Dusty. It's about trusting that even when we don't have all the answers, we're still part of something greater. And you, my friend, are part of something much bigger than you realize. Dusty smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. For the first time, he wasn't searching for answers. He wasn't trying to make sense of the impossible. He was simply accepting it, trusting it, and letting go of the need to control it. The sanctuary fell into a comfortable silence, the soft glow of the candles flickering gently in the quiet. Dusty closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment settle over him like a prayer. He didn't need to see the future to know that everything would be okay. He didn't need to understand the mechanics of his powers to believe that they had a purpose. All he needed was faith, and for the first time in his life, Dusty felt like he truly understood what that meant. As he opened his eyes and glanced at Ethan, Dusty smiled, his heart light with the weight of the realization. Thank you, he said quietly. For everything. Ethan returned the smile, his eyes filled with warmth. I didn't do anything, Dusty. You found the answers yourself. I was just here to help you see them. Dusty chuckled softly, nodding. Yeah, well, I still appreciate it. Ethan stood, placing a hand on Dusty's shoulder one last time before heading toward the door. You're always welcome here, Dusty. Don't forget that. I won't, Dusty promised, his voice steady. As Ethan disappeared through the door, Dusty remained in the pew, his heart full, his mind quiet. He had come a long way, and there was still so much ahead of him. But now, for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't searching for answers. He was simply praying. And as he bowed his head, whispering a quiet prayer for the people he loved, Dusty knew that the power of selfless prayer, the power of love, of hope, of faith, was the greatest strength he had ever known. The end.